to doing something for people, to delivering a better deal to Nova Scotia families. If they really wanted to do it, Mr. Speaker, they could. Now, I have been disappointed over the last few days to hear the Liberal Party oppose our position on the HST, Mr. Speaker. It has come as a surprise and a bit of a disappointment to me to know that the Liberals are opposed to delivering a genuine tax break to Nova Scotia families, Mr. Speaker. Their former leader stood up yesterday and criticized us for asking for this, said that it's the wrong thing to ask for, Mr. Speaker. And the reason, Mr. Speaker, that he said that was because he said it was bad for the environment.
Who else said that?
It's anti-Kyoto, Mr. Speaker. Now, I have a lot of time for the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, Mr. Speaker. I've read their alternative budget, and they say a lot of very interesting and useful things, Mr. Speaker. But on this particular item, Mr. Speaker, they're off base. They're way off base. Their analysis of this issue is very superficial, and so is the Liberal analysis, Mr. Speaker. The simple fact is, in Nova Scotia, 2/3 of Nova Scotia homes are heated with oil. Whether we like it or not, whether we think that something might happen in the future, that is a fact. We have to deal with the facts as they are. 2/3 of Nova Scotia homes heat with oil, Mr. Speaker, and despite the empty protestations of the Liberal Party, who are no more, Mr. Speaker, committed to the environment than that chair in front of me, Mr. Speaker, despite their empty protestations, Mr. Speaker, the simple fact is that Nova Scotians heat with oil. And so if we're going to offer them some relief, we have to take into account the fact that they heat with oil. We also have to take frank account of the fact, Mr. Speaker, that there is not a direct correlation between income and the amount of heat that one uses. Now, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives analysis on this is a very ivory tower, theoretical kind of supply and demand thing where if you cut the price of something, demand will go up by a corresponding amount. It's simply not true, Mr. Speaker, because when you're poor and you don't have a lot of money, there are some things about which you don't have an awful lot of choice. And one of those things is heating your home in a Canadian winter. Whether you like it or not, whether you can afford it or not, you have to heat your home enough just to get by. Now, a lot of people, Mr. Speaker, I have to say, even in my own community, and I've been in their homes and I know this, they keep the thermostat way down. They keep it as low as they can possibly bear because they can't afford to heat it properly. And I'm sure all the members of the House know people in their own communities like this. It is simply not a fact that when one's income doubles, one's use of heating oil doubles. It is simply not a fact that if your income is halved, that you therefore cut your use of heating oil by half. And this is something that the Liberal Party and the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives can't seem to get through their heads, is that heating oil in Nova Scotia today in 2005 is an essential. And that's why we want to offer Nova Scotians a break on their heating oil and other family essentials. Mr. Speaker, we can do it if we want to. We can do it if we want to. But the choice this government has made is instead of offering a better deal for today's families, they offer a corporate tax cut to hugely profitable multinational insurance companies. That's a pretty stark choice, Mr. Speaker, between them and us. I don't think this government has a poverty agenda. I'm not sure that they understand what a poverty agenda would look like, Mr. Speaker. There is far too much poverty in Nova Scotia. We are a wealthy society, Mr. Speaker. In Canada, in Nova Scotia, we are a wealthy society, and it is scandalous how much poverty we have among us. And we don't have to look very far to find it. In my own community of Halifax Fairview, there are two pockets of what can only be described as poverty. Real need, real genuine need, poor housing, substandard housing, people without enough food in the shelves or in the refrigerator to eat in a moderately healthy way, Mr. Speaker. Too many children with inadequate clothing, too many children going to school hungry. That is a tragedy and a scandal. And I do not see this government even beginning to think about planning to address this. Mr. Speaker, that is one of the differences between their government and our party. If we were the government, we would have a poverty agenda, and it would be a priority. Mr. Speaker, I cannot stand the fact that in my community there are children who go to school without enough to eat. I cannot stand the fact that over the 4 years that I've been an MLA, there has been no drop in the demand at the West End Ecumenical Food Bank, which is served out of St. John's Anglican Church, the corner of Dutch Village Road and Joseph Howe Drive in my community, Mr. Speaker. When I was first elected, I said to myself, that will be my barometer. That will be the way that I can tell whether what I'm doing here makes any difference to my community. I've got to see a change in that food bank. I've got to see the numbers going down, the number of families needing that food bank going down. And that as long as that doesn't happen, I know that I'm not accomplishing what I was sent here to do. And Mr. Speaker, I am sorry to say that 4 years later, there is no difference in the number of families in my community who need to go to that food bank just to meet their daily food requirements. On Tuesday, I said to the government across the way that it was a good thing they were instituting a school breakfast program, and it is. In the poorer schools of my constituency, or the ones that draw their students from the poorer areas of my constituency and also the constituency of the member for Halifax-Clayton Park, I hasten to add, because one of the schools, as that member well knows, draws half of its students from my constituency and the other half from her constituency, and it happens to be one of the poorer areas of both my constituency and her constituency. So it's a fairly high-needs school, and they already do have a breakfast program and other ways of feeding their children. And so does Burton Ettinger School, so does Chebucto Heights School, Mr. Speaker. 3 out of the 4 elementary schools in my constituency already do what they can to feed their children. And so it's a good thing that the government is spending enough money, we hope, to cover the rest of the schools in Nova Scotia. We hope it's enough, because we know that our children can't learn if they're hungry. And that's a good thing, Mr. Speaker, but it is, I have to say, a shame that the Department of Community Services can't support our people well enough so that they don't need to also support a school breakfast program. Mr. Speaker, because the fact that the Department of Community Services supports a school breakfast program and actually makes direct donations to food banks, in a way, is an admission of failure, of utter failure of the social safety net. The fact that the basic personal allowance in the social assistance system is not enough to feed people, that they also need to make use of food banks, that they also need to send their children to breakfast programs in school, is an acknowledgement of failure. Mr. Speaker, another area where this government has failed and continues to fail is post-secondary education. Of all the people that I've been able to speak to since the budget was delivered, those that are most in despair, I guess, angry, I think it's more despair than anger, Mr. Speaker. They're way past anger. It's the students. They can't seem to get the government to understand the circumstances that they're facing, what some people have to go through in order simply to obtain a higher education. And we know that that's our future. Everybody says it. What we're waiting for is the government to act on it. Those students, that higher education is the key to better jobs, better work, better productivity, selling ourselves to the world, as an economy, Mr. Speaker, the key is education. We all know it, we all say it, but we don't have a government that appears to believe in it. And the student leaders to whom we have spoken, of all the groups or individuals to whom we have spoken, are the most in despair over this budget. And not only because there's very little that will be of practical help to them, but because the government in this budget went out of its way to take a slap at people who are advocating for a tuition control, Mr. Speaker, by putting in highly selective and misleading information in the budget about the effects of tuition freezes, notwithstanding the fact that 6 other provinces have some form of tuition control. Mr. Speaker, NDP governments, 2 of them, Conservative governments, 2 of them, Liberal governments, 2 of them. Either they know something that our government doesn't know, or our government's just smarter than them. Because this government not only won't go in for tuition control, Mr. Speaker, but they went out of their way in the budget document itself to criticize those who are for tuition control. Perhaps that explains why our students are beyond anger into despair over their future. I graduated 16 years ago from a Nova Scotia university. After a 3-year program, I had a $10,000 debt, Mr. Speaker, and it takes a year at the most for a student these days to run up a debt of $10,000. I don't know how they do it, Mr. Speaker. I frankly don't know how they do it. I don't know how they afford tuitions at the levels that they're at today. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to mention also something else that's missing from the budget, and that's any acknowledgement of the case made by the Cape Breton Regional Municipality for a better deal on equalization. And Mr. Speaker, we may not necessarily agree with the tactics of the CBRM. I personally don't think that this lawsuit idea has a future. I don't think it's going anywhere. I don't think it would have even been thought of if the mayor of CBRM weren't a lawyer himself, who maybe tends to think of things in a legal way. So I'm not necessarily saying that we endorse that lawsuit. But what I am saying is that the fundamental point that CBRM is making is a sound one. This province launched a so-called campaign for fairness to get a better deal. And CBRM has done the same thing. Their point, very simply, is that it's part of who we are as a province to say that no matter what municipal unit you're in Nova Scotia, whether you're in CBRM or whether you're in Yarmouth, whether you're in Antigonish or in Kentville, you should be able to receive roughly equal municipal services at a roughly equal level of taxation. And Mr. Speaker, right now, today, that is not possible for the Cape Breton Regional Municipality. What they are saying is serious. What they are saying is important. And it's disappointing that in this budget, the government simply doesn't address it. While we're talking about Cape Breton, Mr. Speaker, this is probably a good time to speak as well about jobs and job statistics. Because as usual, Mr. Speaker, in the budget address, the government plucked out one statistic and trumpeted that statistic as if that were the whole story. But of course it isn't. The government seems to have trouble in a number of areas telling the whole story. The fact is, on the jobs front, that the jobs are spread very unevenly around Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, very unevenly indeed. And when the government trumpets the latest employment figures, what they skate over is that some parts of this province are doing quite well, thank you very much, and other parts of the province aren't doing that well at all. Let me just give you a flavor, Mr. Speaker, of some of the regional differences. Unemployment in Nova Scotia is both up and down. It depends where you live. There was a decline in the unemployment rate in Cape Breton in 2004, but it is still 15.5%, Mr. Speaker, and none of us should ever accept 15.5% unemployment as normal or acceptable. In the southern region, unemployment dropped, but only to 10.3%. Halifax is doing rather well, you know. Unemployment last year in 2004 averaged 6.1%. But in the North Shore region, Mr. Speaker, unemployment in 2004 was up to 10.0%. And in the Annapolis Valley, Mr. Speaker,
they get a federal MP down there, don't they?
I wonder if the member for Kings North would like to hazard a guess about which way unemployment went in the Valley last year.
Well, if he wants to run federally, he should know.
Which way did it go? Up or down?
What's this question period? You're getting to the house, right?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If he's going to run for federal office, he's going to have to know the answer to these questions, Mr. Speaker. But I don't think he really will. I don't think he really will.
Tomorrow we find out.
I think he's pretty comfortable in his pew here, Mr. Speaker. In any case, Mr. Speaker, the answer, of course, the correct answer to the question is, what way did unemployment go in the Valley last year? It went up. It was up 0.3 percentage points to 8.7%. But there's more to the employment picture as well, Mr. Speaker, and I started by talking about Cape Breton, and let me tell you something else about Cape Breton's unemployment picture, Mr. Speaker, which I, in this House before, and will refer to again as Nova Scotia's dirty little employment secret, Mr. Speaker, and that is the participation rate. The participation rate, which is, what's the participation rate, Mr. Speaker? Well, you take your labor force, and from all the adults 15 and over who are old enough to work, and then you have, Mr. Speaker, the adults who are actually looking for work, who are either working or looking for work. And the participation rate is a measure of how much of your adult population has just written themselves out of the entire labor market, who aren't even bothering to look, Mr. Speaker. And the participation rate in Canada is 66.4%. So on average in Canada, out of every 3 adults, 2 are working or looking for work. In Nova Scotia, the figure is 62.5%, Mr. Speaker, and in Cape Breton, it is one of the lowest participation rates in the country, Mr. Speaker, and the rate in Cape Breton is 49.7%. It has dropped below 50%. Only half of the adults in Cape Breton are either working or even bothering to look for work. And what that is, Mr. Speaker, is a measure of just how bad the employment scene is. That's the hidden unemployment. Because when your economy improves, your participation rate goes up, because more people remove themselves from the sidelines and look for work. For example, in Halifax City, where the economy is going reasonably well, the participation rate is 70.3%. And that's a very good participation rate. That's about as high as you could expect it to be in an area where the economy is going well. But not only is Cape Breton's unemployment rate at an absolutely unacceptable level, Mr. Speaker, but their participation rate is among the lowest in the country. And so the true employment picture in Cape Breton is far, far worse than the statistics reveal at first glance. What is the government doing about that? Well, Mr. Speaker, the answer is not very much. There are more jobs in Nova Scotia, but the problem, Mr. Speaker, is that most of them are heading towards the low-wage side. Yeah. It appears to be the strategy of this government to seek out low-wage jobs, to try and say our competitive advantage is that we have highly educated people, which we do, who are willing to work for very low wages. Yeah. Mr. Speaker, that is no way to sustain an economy. That's no vision for our future, Mr. Speaker. Call centers being a perfect example. Call centers are relatively low-wage jobs, although there's, no 2 call centers are alike, Mr. Speaker. There's some very good call centers in Nova Scotia. In fact, while I'm on the subject, let me just mention one that happens to be in my constituency. Now, my constituency is an urban riding, almost entirely residential. There's very little in the way of industry right in the constituency of Halifax-Fairview, but there's a very excellent call center operation called Portrayal, Mr. Speaker, and they're located on Joseph Howe Drive in Halifax, and they operate without a penny of subsidy from the government. They have high-wage jobs, good working conditions, and they have contracts all over North America. And all that they want from this government is for this government to get out of their way. Yeah. Stop subsidizing their competitors and let them hire Nova Scotians, give Nova Scotians good jobs at good wages. Stop subsidizing their competitors. That's what Portrayal wants, Mr. Speaker. I don't think there's anybody in this House who believes in their heart that once the government subsidies for these call centers run out, that they will stay in Nova Scotia very long. You know why, Mr. Speaker? It's because when you run a low-wage strategy, someone's always going to undercut you. You know, whether it's somebody else in Canada or some other jurisdiction in the United States or Mexico, China, India, anything that depends on telephone technology can be operated from anywhere in the world, Mr. Speaker, and there's always going to be somebody who undercuts you on wages. So, Mr. Speaker, the job statistics are not quite what they seem. This government, I don't think it will come as a surprise to anybody as I say that this government has been lacking a Cape Breton strategy from the day they walked into office. And they simply can't ignore it anymore. They can't ignore the job figures on Cape Breton Island. They can't ignore the desperate financial state of the Cape Breton Regional Municipality, Mr. Speaker. It's not right, it's not fair, it's not reasonable for them to do that. Let me mention very quickly, Mr. Speaker, the agricultural sector, which is, well, let's say that budget reaction is on a scale of 1 to 10, and post-secondary students are down at a 1, Mr. Speaker. Well, the agricultural sector might be at a 3. Yeah. They're very disappointed. Yeah. The reaction of one agricultural sector leader to whom we had occasion to speak was to say, someone in the Department of Agriculture seems to think that the agricultural crisis has passed. That's right. Because if they didn't believe that, there'd be something else in the budget for agriculture. And the best they could say about the Department of Agriculture is that it wasn't gutted this time like it was a few years ago. That it seems like the amount allocated to agriculture is about even. So when you have an entire sector of your economy saying, well, at least they didn't gut us this time, you know that maybe, just maybe, you could have done a little bit more for them. Now, Mr. Speaker, in the very few minutes I have left, I did want to say a few words about our friends, the Liberals. Mr. Speaker, it's very hard to understand sometimes where the Liberal Party is coming from, Mr. Speaker. I mean, this is a party whose glory days are far in the past. Nobody looks back in the 90s as glory days for the Liberal Party. Nobody looks back on the Reagan government of the 1970s as the glory days. They have to go back over 50 years, Mr. Speaker, to go back to their glory days. And it doesn't seem likely that that's going to change, because you look at their reaction to this budget, and they want to have it every which way. Apparently, the Liberals believe at the same time that the Nova Scotia debt should not go up, despite accounting rules, that in fact, it shouldn't go up this year. But what they refuse to say and what they skate around this year as every year is, all right, you don't want the debt to go up. What taxes would you raise? What services would you cut? You can't have it both ways. If you're going to say that the government's got to cut their expenditure, you have a responsibility to say, well, what expenditure? But at the same time, they want to cut out $130+ million from VLT revenues, for which I have a certain amount of sympathy, Mr. Speaker. I personally believe the VLTs are poison, Mr. Speaker. But I also believe that it's far more likely that we're going to be able to do what needs to be done in VLTs by putting the vote to the people. But the issue on VLTs that the Liberals just completely skate around is, what are you going to do about the loss in revenue? Are you going to raise taxes to make it up, or are you going to cut services? You can't have it any other way. You can't cut out $130 million from your budget and just pretend you're going to go on as before. You simply can't. But they have no answer to that. And whenever anyone puts the question to them, they avoid the question. They still don't have a direct answer to that question. They also say, as they repeated in question period today, the gas tax should be cut. So at the same time that they want the government to not allow the debt to increase, they want the government to cut revenue. But you can't hold those two thoughts in your head at the same time, Mr. Speaker, not without fear of some contradiction. And also, their health critic says apparently health spending is too high. Well, that's fine. That's a respectable position. It's not one that I hold necessarily myself.
Like that?
I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker. There should be a rule against heckling from your own benches. But apparently, the Liberal Party's position is that health spending is too high. But if that's their position, then they owe it to us to say which part of the health budget they would cut. Mr. Speaker, they can't continue to have it every which way. The things that the Liberal Party says it believes are contradictory, and Mr. Speaker, I personally, as are many Liberal voters, disappointed with the position of the party. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We look forward to further consideration of this budget. As I said the other day, it's going to be harder than we had hoped for to decide what to do, Mr. Speaker. For the reasons that I've outlined, there are a number of deficiencies, a number of choices that government has made that we as a party would not make if it were our budget. We have to take frank account of the federal political scene, Mr. Speaker. Let's not pretend that that's not a factor. To run simultaneous provincial and federal elections is not something that any of us looks forward to. If it's necessary, we'll do it, but we have to take that into account. So with that, Mr. Speaker, with those observations and our caucus's reaction to the budget, we look forward to further debate over the days and weeks to come. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Recognize the honourable member for Richmond.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Ça me fait plaisir d'avoir l'occasion de répondre au nom de notre parti sur le budget 2005. Comme vous vous rappelez bien, ça fait quelques années que j'étais le critique de finances et là j'ai été critique de différents départements, mais c'est un plaisir de retourner au département de finances, avoir l'occasion de répondre aujourd'hui. Speaker, one thing I can tell you today is that when I look at the political situation here in Nova Scotia, it doesn't take me long to realize there's only one party that's in government. And that's where we wish to be, and that's why the focus of my comments today will be on the party that is in government. Because it would be useless for me to sit here and to talk about a party that's not in government, that has no hopes of being in government, because what is to be achieved by doing that, I would consider it to be useless. And I think Nova Scotians could judge a great deal of the comments from the person who spoke before me as being useless, and I don't intend to go down that road, Mr. Speaker, because the fact is, the budget was tabled by the Honourable Minister of Finance, no one else. The budget is the endorsement of the Premier of this province. The budget is the endorsement of the Progressive Conservative Party of Nova Scotia. It is they that have set this budget here, and it is they that must be held responsible to answer for that, and that is why I intend today to raise concerns on behalf of the Liberal caucus, not about any other party that's irrelevant to the budget, but about the party that is responsible for the budget. So, Mr. Speaker, let me start. This budget, from the day it was tabled, is a budget of excuses. It is an apology for failure. It's an excuse for the last 5 years of neglect of children's education or their well-being. It's an excuse for the last 5 years of losing focus on the issues in our healthcare system. It's an excuse for the last 5 years of adding to the overall debt of the province of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, let me talk about the debt of this province for a few moments. I would say to you, Mr. Speaker, that this may be one of the Premier's greatest failures of his time in office. In 1999, the Premier said, after our 4th year in office, all of the off-book and on-book debt of the province will cease to increase. Now, when we questioned the Premier about that today, he said, well, the debt, when we got in office, we looked and we had to put Cisco, and we had to put NSRL, and we had to put this. Well, that's the off-book debt he was referring to in 1999. So he said he'd put all that in, and yet it still wouldn't increase. 4 years. But we're now in the 6th year, and it's still increasing. You know what, Mr. Speaker? It's going to increase for 2 more years. Now, that may not be of any concern to certain members of this House. It is certainly a concern of ours. Because when you had a Premier who said, and what stronger statement than this, he said, I will not mortgage the future of my grandchildren. Well, it's hard to get a much stronger statement than that. And yet he's done it every year since he's assumed office. He's unapologetic for it. In fact, he has tabled a budget that will add $90 million more to the debt of this province, and he intends to keep doing that for at least 2 more years. Now, that's assuming that their economic projections are correct for the next 2 years, because any sort of economic downturn of any significance will have a dramatic impact on that plan. And I wonder what the excuse will be from the Conservatives at that point. But then again, more than likely, as with the history of this province shows, another party, hopefully ours, will be called upon to clean up the mess that the Conservatives have left. That's what happened in 1993. The only person left in Nova Scotia who looks back on the Buchanan years as the glory years is the Deputy Premier of this province. He just cannot understand why anyone in this House would suggest there was any wrongdoing during the Buchanan years. You can see it in question period. Complete confusion. Complete confusion on his part as to why would any member or any Nova Scotian suggest that the Buchanan years were not the glory years of Nova Scotia. And I think I've figured it out. And I think I know why the Deputy Premier has anger towards the Savage administration. Because, see, that was the administration that educated Nova Scotians about what a deficit was. See, because under the Buchanan years, they never talk about deficits. You know, if they were a little bit off on their numbers, I think one of the finance ministers was off by $200 or $300 million on his budget, and he said, well, you know, better luck the next time. I wasn't as off as what I feared I would be. This is the same government, the Savage government, that educated Nova Scotians on what was the debt and how big it was. Before that, Nova Scotians weren't overly concerned about the debt. They weren't really thinking about this. They didn't know how much of our taxpayers' money was going to pay institutions, financial institutions far beyond Nova Scotia. They were educated on that. So that's why I think the Deputy Premier is angered at that government, because had they just kept quiet and not said anything, we could have just kept on spending and just happy-go-lucky, kept buying electronic toilet seats, building bridges to nowhere with offshore money, and all would have been well. But that nasty Savage government educated Nova Scotians and told them what the true fiscal picture of this province was. Now, see, I told you. I knew by raising this, the Deputy Premier said there was more patronage under the Savage government than ever in the history of this province. Now, you know, I told you, I was serious when I said that only the Deputy Premier still looks upon the Buchanan years as the glory years, and it was good, responsible government as far as he's concerned.
What about Keith Bain and Alfie McLeod,
You know,
huh?
Mr. Speaker,
they
what
were
was going on
qualified,
then, what this government is doing now, and they have the nerve to criticize other administrations, I'll tell you. But once again, Speaker, on the debt, the Premier knew how important it was. He campaigned on that in 1999. He knew how much of an issue it was. And the odd time, you will get him to admit that the previous administration did take steps to control the growth of the debt. The odd time, you'll get him to say that. Not often, because I know the Tory spin doctors don't like him saying that. The odd time, he will make that admission. I'm sure the Deputy Premier won't. But the debt was being put under control. In 1999, this government is quick to criticize what the Liberal government was doing in 1999. Well, let's put something into perspective, especially for the Minister of Education. He was responsible for the education of children that we expect would have some form of education himself and be educated on issues facing this province. See, the budget tabled today the revenues, the yearly revenues in this year are $1.8 billion more than they were in 1999. And yet they sit back and they criticize the government in 1999 for the deficit they claim and the increase in the debt. $1.8 billion more. And yet, guess where the debt's going, Mr. Speaker? The debt is still going up.
Shame on that.
Well, you know, our economy is well. Dumb luck for this government, but it is going well. There's no doubt about that. In fact, Mr. Speaker, most economies throughout our country are going well. There's no surprise about that. What raises an issue is when our economy is going well, why are we still increasing the debt?
Yeah.
That's the question this government needs to ask. So once you're done with your chest thumping, ask yourself that question.
Yeah, why is that, Jamie?
Let's ask a few questions.
Why are we still increasing the
Number
debt?
one, why did you table a budget where you're borrowing $340 million?
Come on, Ray.
Why are you tabling a budget that would increase, put $90 million onto our debt when our economy is doing so well? No, we're going to keep it growing. Yes, we're keeping the debt growing as well. How much longer can we keep it growing? We're keeping the health department spending growing as well. 11% last year, 9% this year. What's it going to be next year? Are we going to reach over 50% of our overall budget? And then the government's going to say our plan is working? It's not working. The one plan that was presented in this budget and that the government has done is our solution to health care is throw more money at it.
Right.
That's it. Because I remember last year during the estimates, and I'll put the question again this year, I'm sure, hopefully his staff will give him a briefing note, but there is no answer. Because my question to the Minister of Health during his estimates last year was, well, if you have a plan for health care, could you please tell us at what point health care will be fully funded? It won't need more money, other than salary increase and that. You couldn't answer the question. Well, now I said, you have a plan, you're going to fix health care. I said, so let me ask you this question. You don't know how much more money it's going to take you. Is health care fixed? Oh, well, he said it's a lot better. Well, that's not fixed. They said they'd fix health care. That's one of the major planks of the Premier. In fact, he had said $46 million, some administrative changes, efficiencies. He told us we had too much bureaucracy in the Department of Health. Remember those days when he said that? We had one Deputy Minister of Health. These guys went to two deputy ministers. I think they had associate deputy ministers, an assistant to the associate deputy minister, and so on and so on. And yet, there's too much bureaucracy before. They've just kept adding every year. In fact, while the Premier said that we didn't need more money in healthcare, we needed better management, he has now, with this budget, put $1 billion more in healthcare. And the problem is there's no end in sight. This is a government that told us they had a plan. This is a government who told us they'd find efficiencies. And what they do is they keep pouring more money. Now, maybe that's not a concern for certain Nova Scotians. I think we heard earlier that it's certainly not a concern for certain members of this House. I would tell you that it's certainly a concern to me. It's a concern to the people I represent. Because when someone tells you that the provincial budget for health is now consuming almost 50% of our revenues with no slowing down in sight, now, if that's not enough to cause alarm to someone, then they should take their head out of the sand. Because we need to start talking about how we are going to have a sustainable healthcare system for the future, because we just can't keep going on this route. So let me go back some of the, as I mentioned, let me go back to the issue of the debt. You know, and again, as opposition, we can sometimes criticize and everything, but I find there's nothing more effective when you're trying to prove a point than to use someone's own words to establish what their commitment was and how blatant they have been in breaking that commitment. So let's go back to some of the Premier's words. April 1999, he said he wouldn't increase the debt. A little bit later, April 17, 2001, the Premier told this legislature, quote, "What I will confirm is that a year from now, this government will introduce a balanced budget, and from that day onward, the debt of this province will no longer grow." That's what he said here in this House. 2001. That wasn't during the election campaign. It was year 2 of his mandate. Why would the Premier make that kind of a statement in 2001 when not only has he continued to increase the debt since that time, he plans on going on for longer? How much more proof do Nova Scotians need that this Premier has broken his promise and that the debt continues to grow? Because you know, Mr. Speaker, We can hear from members of this House talking about essentials, support for families and everything else. Do you know how much money we are paying per year, that Nova Scotia taxpayers are paying on that debt? If I'm not mistaken, it's either just under 900 million or it's just above 900, just under, the Minister of Finance says. $900 million. Now, can you imagine how many breakfast programs that could pay for students? I'd say that you could feed them 3 times a day in our schools with that kind of money. Imagine how many more affordable housing we could build, how many more seniors complexes we could build, how many more roads we could pave. We could not only freeze tuition, we could probably even lower it than where it's at now. How many more nurses, doctors, emergency rooms? That is Nova Scotians' money that goes away every year, and we see no benefit from it. If that is not a concern to certain members of this House, well, I can tell you it is a concern to this party. And the fact that this government, when we have an economy that is strong, we have money coming in an unprecedented fashion from Ottawa, and yet they want to continue increasing that amount of our tax dollars that goes away to foreign institutions outside of Nova Scotia each and every year. $900 million. And someone would have the audacity to stand in this House and to criticize our party for raising concerns about the debt? How much more proof do you need? What kind of responsible party who would even ask Nova Scotians to elect them as a government would say that they have no interest in the fact that $900 million of our tax dollars go away every year just to service that debt? And the question we have to ask, and I'll tell you, as finance critic, this is a real good one, and I wonder how Nova Scotians react to this. Let's look at this situation. $830 million from the offshore accord, if we receive it, it's going to go towards the debt. Now, back where I come from, I would think that the debt's supposed to go down. But let's look at how Tory math works. What Tory math tells us is that $830 million goes on the debt. They're going to have a budget that's going to have a surplus, they claim, of, is it $87 million, or I believe, yes, Minister of Finance says $87 million. Yet, they're going to increase the debt by $90 million. Now, when the Premier talks about his confidence in his record, I wonder how he's going to sell that one to Nova Scotians. $830 million went on the debt. I'm going to have a surplus this year, and the debt's going to go up by $90 million, and as a result, you're going to pay more money in tax dollars for the debt next year. See? Oh, the good old gap. Good old gap. Now, isn't gap just a wonderful thing to have when this Premier and this government needs it? They've changed the rules as they've gone along. They've, each year they've reviewed their books, and under gap, all of a sudden, the deficit became a surplus. There's one gap here that is forming, Mr. Speaker, and that's a gap in the Premier and this government's credibility. Because the fact is, the debt continues to increase. The amount of money Nova Scotians will have to pay continues to go up. And Nova Scotians need to ask, if we can't get our debt under control now, when are we going to? One thing I find interesting is that when they talk about gap, well, one of the things with gap is that the money they're spending on schools and on bridges and on roads doesn't show up on their books at the end of the year. It goes onto the debt. Now, that's a neat little thing that gap allows you to do. Fortunately, we didn't have that in 1999. We had to show that on our books. And that's why you saw deficits at the end of the year, because all of that was on the books. It didn't go on directly on the debt. So that's one of the neat little things that gap allows you to do, that this government can do today that we couldn't do in 1999. And yet, they're still showing only a surplus of $80 million, and the debt's going to increase. Speaker, let me go to another point. Premier and his communications people said that this budget is going to be a legacy budget for the Premier. It's going to reflect his achievements since 1999 to today. Well, let's go back to 1999. Premier said, quote, "We can provide quality health care and balance the budget," end quote. At least that's what the Premier said he'd do during an election campaign stop, July 22nd, 1999, at the Kennard Street Children's Centre. He said that he'd balance the budget He said that he wouldn't have to balance the budget at the expense of health care. He said that he'd balance the budget first, then he'd fix health care. Mr. Speaker, the sad truth is that he promised he could deliver one without compromising the other. It's no wonder that people had such high expectations 6 years ago. Imagine, balanced budget, debt's not going to increase, no new taxes, healthcare is going to be fixed. That was the scenario. Rose-colored glasses were on back then. And today, the Premier suddenly has forgotten all about those commitments. Later, during the same election campaign, the Premier told an audience at Yarmouth Hospital, quote, "We don't need to mortgage the future to meet today's healthcare challenges," end quote. Now, Mr. Speaker, he's doing exactly what he said he wouldn't have to do. The debt is increasing. The Minister of Finance has brought forward a budget where he talks about all of his spending, and yet he's also going to borrow $340 million. Borrowing more money, and the debt will go up by $90 million. Mr. Speaker, let's look at our healthcare system. They said they had a plan. Healthcare would be fixed. I'd love to see the Minister of Health and the Premier come down and tell the people of Richmond County healthcare is fixed. Straight Richmond Hospital, which I'm sure members of the government, all members of the House may have heard me mention a time or two, or a dozen or a couple of dozen times. Emergency room is closed again, and has been closed since January. No emergency room doctor, Monday to Friday, 8 a.m., 5 p.m. Is that fixed health care? Maybe the member from Shelburne thinks it's fixed. Although, wait a minute, his emergency room has been closed as well. Maybe even the Speaker of the House. But no, his emergency room has also been closed. Member for Glaze Bay, member from Cape Breton North, if I'm not mistaken, has seen emergency room closures as well. How much more proof does this government need that they have not fixed health care? And to continue pouring more money in, year out, without a plan, is simply not sustainable. Mr. Speaker, the Premier told Nova Scotians in 1999 that giving him a mandate, he being a family doctor, he would fix health care. How can we have a situation where we hear in this House where the official opposition and our health critics get up to talk about long waiting lists for people needing cancer surgery? How can you say we've got a healthcare system that's fixed when people who are going through the trauma of cancer are being told they should receive treatment traditionally within a certain period of time, but under our circumstances, it's doubled or tripled? How do you tell those people that our healthcare system's fixed? Imagine. That's what's going on. And yet they're pouring in another $218 million this year in the healthcare budget. And that's still the situation we have. We're building MRIs, yet we don't have the people to operate them. The Minister of Health says, well, you need the graduates to have something to play with when they're finished. Well, it's the theory, I guess, of build it and they will come. One would hope that with a real plan, we would have had those people in place so that when communities receive their long-deserved MRI, either for the first time or replacement of some older equipment, that they know that there's someone there who can operate it. Mr. Speaker, we know now just here in the Capital District that 200 to 300 operations will be delayed in May and June because of the lack of specialists. That is the legacy this Premier has left. That is the legacy. And when the media asks, do you really think Nova Scotians want an election? I wonder if they ask those individuals who are on that waiting list whether they think this government should be allowed to continue to govern, or whether they feel it's time that there be a new administration here in this province. Those are the people who should be asked those questions. Mr. Speaker, we remember back then, as I mentioned before, that the Premier is the one who said healthcare didn't need massive investment. He pretty much mocked the Health Investment Fund. Imagine healthcare needing $600 million investment. Liberals have such crazy thoughts. Imagine that, $600 million. This is the government that has poured in $1 billion with no end in sight. Now, Speaker, that's the kind of legacy this Premier has left. And that's the kind of things Nova Scotians will be remembered. Because as much as its spin doctors try to make it look all rosy, that's the reality. And we'll certainly remind Nova Scotians of that. As I mentioned before, with this budget, the health department is going to consume 47% of our total revenues. 47%. As I mentioned before, the Department of Health increased by 11% last year, 9% this year. You know, I remember we were at the Halifax Chamber of Commerce luncheon, and the Minister of Finance was giving his briefing before the budget, and he was asked, is healthcare still sustainable? Because you had an 11% increase last year. What's it going to be this year? And I remember him saying, no, this year we're quite confident the increase won't be in the double digits. It was 9.3%. You're right, it wasn't in the double digits. That's about as close as you can get. And that's how this government looks at it. They just laugh. Throw more money at healthcare, make everyone convinced that you've got some sort of plan, and everything will be fine. You know, a government that can't see beyond the end of their noses, that would be the approach. Fortunately, you have an opposition party here that's continuing to look into the future, and that actually has a genuine interest about our children and our grandchildren, unlike the Premier's hollow words when he spoke about those subjects. We want to make sure that our children and our grandchildren have a publicly funded healthcare system available to them in the years to come. That's going to be affordable and it's going to be sustainable for our province. We are not on the road to achieving that at the rate we are going, and there needs to be some serious discussions about how we can get there. Where is there? And let me give you an example. You know, I know that the certain members of this House, again, I said I wouldn't mention them, so certain members of this House, along with the governing party, have mentioned that, well, in healthcare, the only way that you're going to find savings is if you raise taxes or cut. Well, that's interesting, see, because that's about as small-minded as you can get. And there are some who suffer from that affliction without me naming them. Well, let me give the example that our health critic brought up. Joey McDonald. Joey McDonald's in a hospital. The man has said, and he has begged this government, with his wife, to be allowed to go home, to have more home care services at home so he can be at home with his 3 children. He's got a disease that is going to lead to his death. We don't know how long. But he said, my wish is I be able to die at home with my family. The amount of money it costs to keep him in that hospital bed are astronomical compared to what it would cost to give him increased home care at home. That is the kind of savings that we are talking about. That is the common sense that we are talking about. Long-term care beds, you have people, it's been admitted by the Department of Health, people sitting in hospital beds that's costing thousands a day that could be in a long-term care facility. The beds aren't there. That's the kind of savings we're talking about. That doesn't require tax increases. It doesn't require cuts. It requires common sense. It requires a vision, requires a plan, something that's obviously void of this government and void of other members of this House of certain parties when they say, how are you going to achieve savings in healthcare? Let me give you another example. We used to have a program, the in-home support program. I know the Minister of Education will be familiar with it. He received dozens of letters from me on it. Soon, let me tell you about the program. Here's what this program was. Again, no need for tax cuts, no need for tax increases or cuts. Let's see what this program did. The in-home support program was meant to provide financial assistance to families who kept loved ones at home. The idea being was to provide them with some sort of compensation for the fact that they left their employment or are unable to go to a job because they are caring for mom, dad, uncle, aunt, or whoever it might be. They're keeping that person at home where they wish to be, surrounded by family, receiving loving care, instead of being put in a long-term care facility. Long-term care bed costs how much? Almost $1,000 a day, or just under that? Or let's say $100 a day, whatever the figure is. In-home support program provided $400 a month to family caregivers. $400 a month. Let's say long-term care bed, $80 a day. We'll figure that out over a run of a month and do the math. This government froze that program in 2000 because they wanted to review it. They wanted to review it. Everyone who was in the program stayed, got their funding, fortunately. No one's been allowed in for now 5 years, and this budget makes no mention of bringing that program back. So what happens? Families have to make a fiscal choice. Can we afford to have one or both not working because we're caring for a loved one, or are we forced to make the choice of putting that loved one in a long-term care facility? And that's what's happening. So that is another example of where if you took money and invested it in programs such as in-home support, you would be able to save money to the healthcare system. Because although the government has announced that there's more hours for home care doesn't spend the night. They're not there when a parent or a loved one has to go to bed. They're not there in the middle of the night when they have to get up to use the washroom. They're not there in the morning when they first wake up, but the caregiver is. That's what this program was meant to assist with. That was supposed to be a savings to the system. That is just but one other example of how we can make savings in our healthcare system if we properly invest our money. That's just a few. I'm sure there's many more, and I'm sure healthcare providers could suggest many more. So for anyone to say, well, the Liberals are saying the debt should increase and they should tell us where they're going to cut in health, again, small-minded is what it is. Cheap and small-minded. Let me say both. It's what it is. This government does not have a plan for healthcare. They do not have a plan that reflects the wants of Nova Scotians. By canceling programs such as the in-home support program, it flies in the face of Nova Scotia values. It flies in the face of Nova Scotia lifestyle. And yet we wonder why healthcare spending is consuming almost half of our budget and there's no end in sight. Mr. Speaker, I spoke today. The Premier said, no new taxes if you elect me. No new taxes. Remember that. We spoke today about in 2002, 2 cents a litre. They needed 2 cents a litre to be able to fix our roads. Well, I'll tell you, the people who live on, was it Como Road? Is that what it's called? Como Road? I'm sure they're wondering where that 2 cents a litre went. But that's 2 cents a litre. How much really is that? Now, we know Scotians are pumping at the pumps today, and they're looking, it's 99.9 cents a litre. What's 2 cents? That would only knock it down 97.9 a litre. That's not much. Well, it's $25 million a year coming out of the pockets of Nova Scotians. $25 million is what that 2 cents has brought. So this being the 4th year of that tax increase that the Premier said he wouldn't do, by the end of this fiscal year, that'll be $100 million extra on top of the high taxes Nova Scotians already pay for their fuel that is going into government coffers. And yet this year, they would tell us that the economy is strong, we're going to have a surplus, everything, yet we're going to continue to have this tax increase in place. The minister says it's all going on roads. Well, I'll tell you, people in Richmond County would like to know where it's going. People driving on the 104 just by the Straight Richmond Hospital between there and Port Hawkesbury that see whole sections of the pavement that have just disappeared. The top layer is gone. They're zooming back and forth between lanes on a 100 series highway. They'd like to know where that money's gone. And I'm sure there's members all around this House that would like to know where that money is gone and where that money is going. This is the government that took user fees, and arbitrarily increased 500 user fees in this province. And then they say in this budget, we're going to spend $500,000 to see how we can cut red tape and make working with government more friendly. 500 increases. Minister of Justice took the fine system and just arbitrarily increased all the fines that he could think of here in this province. To show you how desperate they were to get more money out of Nova Scotians' pockets, they even increased one of the fines dealing with leaving your horse unattended. Because, you know, that's certainly a serious offense here in Nova Scotia these days. You know, you can't walk down Halifax without seeing those unattended horses wandering all around. That shows the desperation of this government to try to find new ways of taking money out of Nova Scotia's pockets. So to say that one tax itself is the demon here, this government has come up with just an amazing amount of ways of taking money out of Nova Scotians' pockets. And that's a serious concern if this province is going to continue to grow, if we are going to have families that are going to continue to succeed, to be able to provide properly for their families when we have that kind of an administration. That's not what was promised in 1999. That's certainly not what Nova Scotians expected. Let me say again, Mr. Speaker, 6 years later, we have 6 years of what I'd say is missed opportunities. We have 6 years of neglecting our education system. 6 years of increased fees, increased taxes. 6 years of neglecting our roads. 6 years of watching our offshore industry deteriorate. 6 years of no growth in the tourism sector. You know, ever since they created a standalone Department of Tourism, we've been losing money every year on our tourism revenues. And yet this government would try to have us believe that the tourism industry is doing great. Well, let the minister go out and talk to tourist operators in this province. Come down to Richmond County and ask them if they think tourism is doing great under his administration. They'll certainly have a mouthful to share with him. He knows it's not true. Revenues aren't going up. And yet he's created these imaginary projections that no one truly expects him ever to be able to achieve. And Mr. Speaker, what we've also seen is 6 years of skyrocketing tuition with no plan at all to try to help Nova Scotia students. And most disappointing, it's 6 years, Mr. Speaker, of rural depopulation. This government has sat quietly while it's watched some of our small communities die off. Mr. Speaker, this budget has tried to make up for 6 years of lost opportunity. This budget, the question that remains on the minds of all members is whether this budget does truly deserve support. Have they presented a plan here that Nova Scotians feel properly represents where they want our province to go? That is the question that we need to ask ourselves. Mr. Speaker, in mentioning, I talked about tourism. I look at the Minister of Energy. They talk about the Offshore Accord. The Offshore Accord is based on the Sable project, a Sable project that was in place before this government even came to office. There has been no new development since that time. They've put all sorts of conditions in the Accord dealing with future projects. And Nova Scotians have to ask, 6 years, when are you going to have a future project? We have a Department of Energy that has pretty much failed in being able to work with industry to attract more investment here in this province. We have a few projects that are taking place, but they're almost happening accidentally. In fact, it's happening in spite of this government. I can tell you, the Anadarko LNG facility is coming to Point Tupper. I certainly hope that the Minister of Energy is not going to try to take credit for that project. But that's an example of where this government has failed. And yet they tell Nova Scotians, have faith in us, in the future, and in development. How much longer do we need to go? When you see that when they talk about our offshore industry, Mr. Speaker, the sad reality is, and it saddens me to say, we don't have an industry. We hope to have an industry. We have a project. We have a project that was put in place by a previous government. 6 years they have had to build on that. 6 years of disappointment is what we have had. Mr. Speaker, what's even more disappointing is not only have we not seen growth in our offshore, last year we saw the spectacle of the Minister of Finance announce, I have a surplus. My budget is balanced. I reviewed it, and I think we're all set. So, upon face value, maybe that was true. So then, naturally, someone started asking questions. Well, how did you suddenly find money that would allow you to balance your budget and have a surplus? Well, lo and behold, there was $40 million they found. So the question was, well, where did you find $40 million? So at that point, I'm sure, in the lowest voice the minister could find, he said, that's the penalties paid by offshore companies who abandoned offshore leases in Nova Scotia. Well, congratulations, Minister. What a proud achievement. You managed to balance the books on the backs of companies abandoning investment in our province. What a proud day for Nova
But they were
Scotians.
coming this way
That's
instead
what
of
you
going
call
the other way.
growing the economy.
That certainly is growing the economy. How many more can we get to leave our province next year?
You only got one left.
Well, let me tell you, he did even better this year. Because this year he got $55 million from companies who abandoned our province. Another legacy piece for this premier. $95 million that he's managed to get out of those nasty offshore companies to make them go away. That's a legacy for you. I wonder if they'll put that in the history books in talking about the premier's
Never
achievements.
successful as disabled.
$95 million in failure is what this government has used. And that's what's included in these budget figures, showing the surplus of $87 million from last year. No, $63 million. You get $55 million that came from the abandonment of offshore leases.
Yeah, that's right.
What's it going to be next year? More? At what point are we going to say we need to try to develop an industry rather than the one project that we have?
Who brought that project?
$95 million in 2 years. Now that's certainly performance by this government and by this premier. Mr. Speaker, the offshore accord was an achievement for our province. We agree to that. You know, the premier went and told all Nova Scotia MPs, especially the Liberal ones, I need your support to get this deal signed. And they had the media asking each and every Liberal MP, are you going to lobby, and this is it for you if you don't sign, and the whole Tory way of doing things. So the deal got signed. February 14th, Prime Minister was here, Valentine's Day. It was a very simple message. Promise made, promise kept. It was true. Deal was signed. Deal was there. Now we have a situation where, lo and behold, who is upholding Nova Scotia? Who is preventing Nova Scotia from getting our $830 million? Stephen Harper, the Conservatives, and the Bloc Québécois, separatists. And how ironic that now that there's been an agreement between the Prime Minister and the leader of the NDP to pass the budget, they're short 3 votes. Might be the independents. But where else could they find 3 votes that would assure that Nova Scotia and Newfoundland Labrador get the money owed to them? How many Conservatives do we have here in Nova Scotia?
Too many.
We have 3. Imagine, someone said too many. I can't agree more. But the reality is we have 3. Now, has the Premier picked up the phone and said, look, put your partisan politics aside. This is $830 million for the people you represent. We're losing $1 million a week that could be going to your constituents because of the political grandstanding. Put it aside, pass the budget, and whatever you got to do afterwards, so be it. But make sure Nova Scotians are your #1 priority in this. He refuses to. Comes up here with the silliness of telling us it's not on the order paper for next week, after there's already been an agreement to support the budget. All Canadians know it's going to come to a vote, yet the Premier relies on saying it's not on the order paper. Quite ironic, an order paper that's only going to be printed tomorrow. That is the foolishness we've heard from this Premier. Asked today, would he stake his political career? Would he give Nova Scotians his word for whatever it's worth after all the broken promises? He chose not to. Yet, we're supposed to believe that this is going to happen. Mr. Speaker, since the beginning of April, we've now lost $4 million. I wonder how many roads we could have done with $4 million. How much could have gone to help students with tuition? $4 million. Then the Premier tells us, well, if it doesn't pass this spring, it'll pass in the fall. Or it pass sometime anyways. Well, if it's in the fall, that could be another, 4, 5, 6 months. Over $20 million, if not worse, could be lost. And then the Premier has the audacity, knowing this is the Premier of Bill 68, knowing this is the Premier who put paramedics on strike, knowing this is the Premier who pretty much ruled with an iron fist when he had a majority, now says, well, if the Prime Minister would separate the bill from his budget, it would get passed. Well, how many times did he separate anything out of his budget to suit either the official opposition or to suit our party? Not once. Yet he would have Ottawa stand up to a different standard than what he has used here in this province. Mr. Speaker, at the end of the day, this budget allow me to say, has certainly numerous items in it that are a positive nature. I think Nova Scotians agree with that. Our party, our health critic, certainly was a strong voice in lobbying for self-managed attended care. Again, a means of saving the system money and a means of respecting the challenges that people have who are in that situation. There's more money coming for it. Is it enough? We'd like to have seen more. It's a start. There's also money, and we certainly hope to see more. There's also money to help low-income families who have children with diabetes. Again, very important initiative. Not sure if there's the right amount of money in it, but it certainly is a start. And then there's also money in there to help children with autism. Those are all very laudable goals. I could mention a few more. There is more money in there for legal aid. That's certainly something that I've been pursuing with the minister, and I know that the Legal Aid Society has been pushing for as well. That is another positive initiative as well. So there are an amount of initiatives that are in there that are positive. There are a number of them within the Department of Health. The question becomes with the Department of Health is how much longer can we keep going the pace we're at? And maybe during estimates, the Minister of Health can tell us that he knows exactly at what point we will stop having to pay on health because it will be fully funded. It'll be properly funded. You might even see the day where he says health care is fixed. I don't think he'll say it today, though. Not after the questions he received about the wait time for people trying to get cancer treatment in Halifax. I don't think he'll say it's fixed there. Emergency room is still closed at the Straight Richmond. No end in sight there. We're still waiting for the Richmond Villa. At least we got a sign up now. It's a big step. It took us almost 3 years to get a sign, but we got a sign. There's a picture on it. We're one other step. Hopefully you'll be able to tell us when we can expect, more importantly, when the residents can expect to have that new facility. Mr. Speaker, I want to be able to wrap up my comments in saying that our role here has been to raise concerns for Nova Scotians. Yes, our economy, granted, has been doing well. Yes, we've received unprecedented amounts of money coming from Ottawa. Yes, we have a budget that's based on receiving $830 million that we're still not sure of. We are concerned about that. We are concerned and we want to do everything possible to make sure we do get that money, that Nova Scotians do have a budget that represents their priorities, and that the debt of this province is brought under control. And the fact that we are told to wait 2 more years before we see a reduction that causes us a great deal of concern. Mr. Speaker, we presented a plan to this government to deal with VLTs. We have seen the Premier get up and give excuses about not banning them, about underground economies, about Hell's Angels showing up in downtown Arishat and in Pugwash and in Musquodoboit Harbour and North Kingston and those communities. Ridiculous is basically what it's been, and yet we continue to see the devastating impact that this is having on individuals, on families, and on our communities. Speaker, I was home last week and I had a chance to attend a few functions. And I couldn't believe how many came over and just tapped me on the shoulder. And I was at a convention, so a lot of them I wasn't familiar with, but they just came over and said, keep up the good job on those VLTs. They're poison, we got to get rid of them. Couldn't believe how many came up and said that. Didn't say who they were, they just tap on the shoulder, keep up the good work. How many other Nova Scotians are saying that? How many more? And for any government member to suggest that they're not aware of the damage that's been caused by VLTs is completely irresponsible. It's almost making a mockery of those who are suffering from that. Because if you don't know the individual suffering, then you should certainly know about your church group that's suffering, your community hall that's suffering, your economic development group that's suffering, your service group that's suffering. Because in small rural town Nova Scotia, they are hurting significantly because of VLTs. And yet again, as he did with smoking, the Premier tries to do a little bit while pretty much doing nothing at all towards a long-term solution. Half measure for smoking, half measure for VLTs, half measure for student relief under the interest relief program. Cut the program, then he brought it back, only half the funding. That is but one more example. And the question today, just again, I heard the predecessor who spoke before me mention cost of tuition, university. Well, Mr. Speaker, as I've mentioned many times, I attended Dalhousie from 1991 to 1997, 6 years. $35,000 is the wonderful gift that was left after my graduation. And I'm not going to complain because fortunately I was able to pay it off, and I believe it was in February I got the last letter that started off with saying, I got a letter from the bank, and no one likes to see letters from the bank, but it said, congratulations, you have finally paid off your student loan. $35,000 back in 1997 is probably double, if not triple that, for students today who are going to attend a professional school after their undergraduate degree. It's impossible to maintain that kind of a financial debt. We are going down the road where, once again, like in the old days that I've heard of so often, that families will have to choose which child is going to go to school. Which one do we send? Because we can't send 3, we can't send 2, so which one's it going to be? Is that how we're going to grow our province? The minister responsible for immigration finally has a budget to set up an office, buy some furniture. Not going to have very much left in that budget for much programming. But he says, come to Nova Scotia, come study here, and yet universities are increasing the costs for foreign students to come study here. Ontario, if I'm not mistaken, has actually been doing everything possible to lower, if not eliminate, tuition for foreign students to come study there, hoping they will stay afterwards. Our approach is, let's ding them for as much as we can while they're here. That's the approach of this government, and there's no end in sight. Come to Nova Scotia, but make sure you have money, because it's going to be an expensive visit when you come to our province. Mr. Speaker, allow me to finish in saying this. This budget, I do agree, this budget is a good reflection of the Premier's tenure in office and the government's record since 1999. As we all recall, and as I mentioned back then, the Premier said he'd fix health care, would stop the debt from growing, and he would not raise taxes. This budget is proof to all Nova Scotians the healthcare system is not fixed. The debt is still growing and will continue to grow for years to come. And taxes are up, meaning more money is leaving the pockets of Nova Scotians and Nova Scotia families. And yet the Premier remains unapologetic. Mr. Speaker, our leader, Francis McKenzie, and our caucus will listen to Nova Scotians. For it is they that will tell us how much longer they are willing to put up with the Premier's broken promises, half measures, and lack of vision. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The estimates are now referred to the Committee of the Whole House on Supply. Recognize the Honourable Minister of Tourism, Culture, Heritage and Health Promotions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call public bills for second reading, Bill number 168.
Public bills for second reading, call on Bill 168. And I'll recognize the Honourable Minister to open debate.
Well, Mr. Speaker, recognizing on behalf of my colleague for Bill number 168, with respect to the bill, Mr. Speaker, see now I have to look back at the number here. But, Mr. Speaker, I'll move second reading on behalf of my colleague. And I'm sure he'll have comments following the members across the floor.
Thank you, Minister. I'll recognize the Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Okay, Mr. Speaker, I hope my comments are more cogent than his. Mr. Speaker, well, my goodness, hey? No, don't follow those rabbit tracks, especially by such an avid non-hunter as the member from Glace Bay. Mr. Speaker, 168 is an interesting bill because it brings or purports to bring in line securities and commissions from across the country and would allow a freer flow of access for brokers in particular. And while the bill substantively isn't a bad bill, the bill does not really take into consideration the group of people that we should look after first. And the people we should be looking after first is not, can the brokers do deals from Vancouver and have them honored here in Halifax, or be seen as them having standing here somewhere in Nova Scotia. What we should be doing when we're looking at securities is the fact of who's being protected here. That the reality is that what we should be first and foremost doing is building protection for the consumers. You know, I'm sure some of my other colleagues, Mr. Speaker, when they get up, will talk probably more about today's marketplace as it relates to mutual funds and so on, Mr. Speaker, because we have become a society in the last short while of people that invest a lot of our retirement savings in mutual funds. And from what protection a lot of people really gather from that, we don't know. Quite honestly, it's one of the real last areas of consumerism where we're buying a pig at a poke. We don't know. You know, people are being advisors, people putting up shingles and saying, I'm a financial advisor, I can help you, and people's real understanding.
Order. The honourable member has the floor. Okay, Britton Center. Continue.
So people's understanding of what's in there, where their money goes after they invest it. You know, I'm kind of buoyed by the saying or by the quote from the television show Coronation Street, where Jack Duckworth once said, the stock market, all that is bingo for the rich. That's right. So, Mr. Speaker, that's what, for a lot of people, that's what it is. They don't understand it. They put out their money, and hopefully they have the faith in their broker, and their broker will not abscond with their funds, or that the funds that the broker invests in are going to perform the way they purported to run. But, Mr. Speaker, you know, we don't have to go too far down the road when we speak of the Enrons and the Toyco, and indeed, Mr. Speaker, in our own country, the scam purported on us by Bre-X. So these are real problems that I believe that a bill to talk about securities should talk about consumer protection around securities. But let's go about this here in another avenue also, Mr. Speaker, and talk about what this could do to the people in the securities business in this province. Are we going to see a loss of jobs in that sector? Is this going to allow people that would ordinarily, firms that would employ people in different regions of this province, saying, well, look, you know, you're licensed right across the country. You can access that market from anywhere. These people have signed the passport, so you can go in there and do your work. So what we'll do is we'll close the Nova Scotian offices, and we'll keep the Bay Street office in Toronto and fly you down once a month, or we'll do everything by email or by fax. So what we're seeing here is what we could see here is a closure of some of these jobs in this market, and they're allowed to retain them in Ontario, which I would hope would not be the offshoot of this. But clearly, when reading Bill 168, there's nothing to stop that flow back, Mr. Speaker. There's not that type of catchment that we would have in our sinks, that we have a catch that things don't roll back on us, Mr. Speaker. So that's a real problem here, Speaker. And, you know, what else can happen here? What we also see is, are we in danger of accepting the lowest common denominator? Are we going to take it from the jurisdictions that have the worst regulations, and are we going to start from the bottom instead of the top? So that's what we need. We need more clarity from government. If they're going to accept the worst regs and make ours more porous here, then it makes no sense to move forward with this bill. So, Mr. Speaker, with those thoughts of what happened in the market with with such scoundrels as Enron and Bre-X, the possibility of consumer protection, which we should see here, the idea of possible job losses in the commodities field, and indeed the idea of having maybe lower regulations than we do now. These are the focus we would like to see brought forward as this bill goes through this House. Thank you for your time, Mr. Speaker.
Motion is for, oh, no, I'm sorry, I'll go to the recognize the honourable member for Halifax Atlantic. Halifax, Shabakto. Yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My friend and colleague from Cape Breton Centre, I think, has opened up a topic that should be compelling for all of us. Because the problem is not so much what this bill does, but what it fails to do. And in failing to address the problems with securities, particularly mutual funds, that so many citizens face, the bill displays very starkly the set of priorities that seems to commend itself entirely inappropriately to this government. Because anyone looking at this bill has to ask themselves the following question: why is it that when the government turns its mind to the problem of securities and security sales, to the population, to the middle class who buys these things, their step is to look to regulating and making life easier for those who sell them, rather than looking to protect the customers? Now, it's not that there are no protections already in place for customers. The problem is that there is an opportunity here to strengthen those protections. And I want to illustrate the way in which the middle class needs these protections. Now, there's probably no one who's more middle class than I am, I have to confess. In fact, in many respects, so far as I can tell from my chats with my colleagues here in the House, we all seem to have managed to arrive in this state. We're all of a certain age. Many of us have spouses or ex-spouses. Many of us have children. Many of us have houses. Many of us have mortgages. In the words of the Greek novelist Nikos Kazantzakis, the whole disaster. We've all found ourselves in the middle of this position of having accumulated these things, including, of course, many financial obligations. Now, I know that in my family, when our children were born, we started to put money aside for their university education. And so the money is invested, and lo and behold, the children are now of an age that they're getting ready to go to university, and we happen to have a few dollars put aside. And of course, families, that's a common situation for families to be in, is they're investing for the education and future of their children. And the other main thing that families will often put money aside for is their own retirement. Because of course, every year that goes by, every 12 months that goes by, we get at least a year older. Often feels like more. My dad often says, it ain't the years, it's the mileage. But as we move along, we have to plan for our retirements. And this is what the middle class does. They try to put money aside for their retirements. And many people, if they're fortunate enough to have a pension plan at work, will put money aside through those pension plans. But you know what? Lots of people don't have pension plans at work. Lots of people have to put their own money aside for their savings, for their retirement, year in, year out, hoping that they will accumulate enough money so that when the time comes, they're able to replace their pre-retirement income at a level that will support life according to their needs and obligations at that stage of their life. Now, what that means for most people is that they're going to buy investments that will typically be stocks and bonds. But you know what? For most people, they don't understand how to buy stocks and bonds. They don't invest directly in the stock market themselves. They don't make their own decisions about what stocks and bonds to buy. They don't read the financial pages every day. They don't look at the reports of the trading in the stock market every day. They don't have time to do it. And for many people, frankly, of course, they don't understand it. Nor should they have to. So what most people do is they put money into mutual funds. And here's what a mutual fund is. A mutual fund is essentially a pooling of investment money managed by professional managers. And the only decision that the individual makes is which mutual fund they're going to put their money into. And then they trust that the managers of these funds will take care of their money and will invest it in an appropriate way, sufficient over the long term to bring returns to them so that they can get on either with their financing of their children's education or with their retirement. Those really major financial expenses that so many members of the middle class encounter. And often, what people will do is not choose mutual funds themselves directly. Frequently, if people are turning their minds to it, what they'll do is they'll take an intermediary step. They'll go to a financial advisor and they'll say, I have money to invest, I need to invest money. Why don't you make some suggestions to me about what mutual funds I might put my money into? And it's those people, those financial advisors, that we're talking about in this legislation. And what this legislation does is it says that someone who is qualified under the laws of any province of Canada to be in this business can automatically come here and do it in Nova Scotia. Well, as correctly pointed out by my colleague from Cape Breton Centre, this is likely to mean centralization of this function. It's likely to mean some loss of jobs in Nova Scotia as companies provide this service out of Toronto, out of Montreal, out of Calgary. But that isn't my main worry. It's a point that we should be concerned about. What I'm worried about is that we're not focusing on protecting consumers. And here's the problem with the mutual fund industry. And for those of you who want to follow along with the details of this, I suggest you want to read a book that was just published this year about the mutual fund industry in Canada, and it's called The Naked Investor by one John Reynolds. Any of you who have money invested in mutual funds after reading this book will just want to slit your throats. Now, I am happy to say that I have no money invested in mutual funds. And that was true even before I read this book by Mr. Reynolds. But I want to summarize for you a few of the things that Mr. Reynolds has to say and that he points out about the mutual fund industry in Canada. Its first departure point is to recognize that the performance of mutual funds has not been good. For the middle class, for the thousands of Canadians, the hundreds of thousands of Canadians, and the thousands here in Nova Scotia who are planning for their retirement based on the return from their mutual funds, I hope they think again and think seriously. Because the record of returns for mutual funds in Canada has simply not been all that good. We turn our money over to professional advisors, and sometimes through professional advisors, professional managers who are supposed to be doing such a wonderful job. When I read John Reynolds' book, I was reminded of an earlier book from the 1940s talking about stockbrokers. And that book was called Where Are All the Clients' Yachts? Perfectly good question. Where are all the clients' yachts? It's the stockbrokers. It's these so-called professional advisors who make money coming and going. When stocks and bonds are bought, they get paid a commission. When they're sold, they get paid a commission. Doesn't matter to them if it goes up or down, but it sure matters to the people who are their clients, whether it goes up or down. And we're asking them to exercise professional judgment on our behalf. And yet all too often, the results are pretty dismal. Now, I'm mentioning this so that we can take thought, not just for ourselves as individual investors here, but on behalf of all the thousands of investors in Nova Scotia who are virtually defenseless. Now, in terms of raw return, the record is pretty bad. In terms of return to the investors, it's even worse because, of course, you're charged an annual fee for the professional services that are being offered by these professional money managers. And in most Canadian mutual funds, that's around 2.75% each year of the value of the dollars you have invested, which means that their returns have to be at least 2.75% every year before you get zero. In other words, they pay themselves first. They call it an MER, a management expense ratio. So right off the top, if you were hoping for a 7% return on your money each year, they're going to have to make 9.75% return before you get your 7, if that's what you're hoping for. But in many years, they're not doing that. They're just plain not doing that, but they're getting paid. Often their returns, if you look at it, if you look at the stats that are available at so many websites or in the newspapers that look at mutual funds and their returns, you'll find that their annualized returns are around 3%, 4%, 5%. But what you've got to remember when you see that is their management expense ratio comes right off of that before you get anything. So if it's 5%, you're getting 2.25%. Not such a good deal. But you know what? The management expense ratio, which is this fee, this annual fee, it's not one time, it's this annual fee that you pay them, is not the only opportunity they get for making money. There's another opportunity. And here's what it is. If you decide that you don't like the quality of performance of your mutual fund, and you decide you want to get your money out and put it somewhere else, you're hit a penalty. And that is usually a penalty that you have to pay any time in the first 5 years, sometimes longer, but usually in the first 5 years in which you have your money invested. Now, usually it's a sliding scale. If you pull out your money within the first year, the amount of penalty that you have to pay is higher than if you pull it out in year 5. But nonetheless, it's a penalty that you have to pay to get your money back because your investor, the professional investor to whom you're paying 2.75% every year already, isn't doing as well as you think they ought to do. And they're still charging you a penalty to reassign your money to a better place. So I want to know why it is that the government isn't taking the lead in trying to bring these kind of expenses and fees under control. That would be a service to the consumers of Nova Scotia. That would be an important service to the consumers of Nova Scotia. Now, you know what? It gets worse. It gets worse.
No, tell me it's not. No.
Remember I said earlier that people who don't pick their mutual funds by themselves but go to professional advisors and ask them to pick mutual funds for them, they're a big sector. Lots of people will do this. Lots of people will think they're being prudent. But just think back to that scenario a moment ago in which the mutual fund isn't doing so well. Suppose you go to your professional advisor and you say, you know, those mutual funds that you suggested, I think they're not doing so well. Could we maybe make a switch and go somewhere else? If you've ever had this experience, you will probably find what I've found when I've talked with some of my friends and relatives, because their professional advisors say to them, stay the course. Stay the course, the market will turn. But you know what? Have you heard of trailing fees? If you haven't heard of trailing fees, let me tell you what trailing fees are. A trailing fee is an amount of money that the mutual fund pays to your financial advisor so long as you, the client, keep your money invested in their mutual fund. In other words, it's in their financial interest, these professional advisors, for you to keep your money in the fund, whether the fund is doing well or it isn't. They're in a conflict of interest position, and there is nothing in Canadian law that regulates that. And there sure is nothing in this bill that regulates that or even suggests it. Now, what I want to know is, why is it that the finance ministers of this country, in the provinces, why is it that the ministers who deal with consumer protection in this country are not taking the lead in saying to the mutual fund industry, your fees are too high and there are conflict of interest situations that are built into how this industry operates, and it's bad for consumers and something has to change here. That would be a service to consumers. That would be something that ought to happen here. And you know what? There's no reason why we couldn't start doing that right here. Even though we don't have a big mutual fund industry of our own in terms of mutual funds that are rooted here or agents that are rooted here, although we have some, we could start this. This is an ideal service that could be performed for citizens all across Canada. There are millions of Canadians out there who are being plundered. Their savings for their children, for university and post-secondary education, and for their own retirement are being plundered in a way that is unconscionable. So, Mr. Speaker, although I've taken a few minutes, I've really made one point and one point only. This bill has the wrong set of priorities. This bill says, what can we do to make life easier for the people who sell mutual funds? It doesn't say, what can we do to protect and make life easier and better and wealthier for the investors who are involved in the securities that they sell. That's the right set of priorities, and that's what's missing from this bill and generally from that government. Thank you very much.
Member for Halifax Atlantic.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like the opportunity very briefly to address this question because it's been pointed out by my colleagues. This is something which is of grave importance to many small and medium-sized investors, by which we mean families. We mean mothers and fathers, parents of children, and in fact the children of our seniors who may in fact need our financial protection as they proceed later in their lives. We cannot afford to allow these protections to allow the ability to protect oneself financially to disappear lightly. The one thing that I'd like to point out in this, which is of the greatest concern to me, is quite simply the timeline. We are engaged already in a continuum of harmonization. At the moment, we have what's called mutual recognition of the provisions of the various provinces for the regulators, for the registrants and the issuers of stocks traded in Canada. So the mutual recognition means that at this moment we have a certain limited acceptance of one another's rules. Beyond this is what's called the passport system, which is intended to be integrated here, and further an enhanced passport system, eventually leading to what's referred to as a fully harmonized uniform securities law. Now, in Canada, securities are a provincially regulated function, and I think it is important to realize that this has been done for some particular reason. We do not have it as a federal responsibility. If we have a uniform securities law, it will be tantamount to making this a financial responsibility. The securities administrators are asking for the legislative authority to make delegation and subdelegation to other jurisdictions. And the timeline along which all of this is to happen is of grave concern to me. August 2005. That is weeks away from now. And if there's nothing else that I understand, and I'm sure the other members of the House understand from this, is that the world of securities, mutual funds, bonds, is a complex one. And the rules which govern those issuers of stocks and of venture capitals, as well as those who trade them and who take commissions on their trade, are an extremely complex regulatory system. And if we are simply going to say that by August 2005 we'll all be in line, it's like we've all said, we're going to agree by August 2005. We don't know what we're agreeing to, but we're going to agree to it. And I worry that this is something that may not, in fact, tend to the greater protection of the Nova Scotian consumer. When we look at the preamble to the current instrument, there is considerable talk about improving access to capital markets. Improving access to capital markets is improving access to capital for issuers. It is not improving access to capital for those who are, in fact, the suppliers of capital, the small and medium-sized suppliers of capital, who may have very carefully, over a very long time, have gathered themselves.
Order, please. There's too much noise in the chamber. I ask that all members take their conversations outside, please. All member for Halifax Atlantic has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In fact, I'm almost ready to close at this point, but as I say, it's very important that we do not allow this sort of a system to be cobbled together in a matter of weeks for us, in fact, as Nova Scotians, to delegate the responsibility for the making of rules which protects Nova Scotians, sometimes in the face of very, very large and complicated systems, from a loss of their hard-earned savings. One of the other things which is in here is the possibility of looking at fee review for the regulators themselves. These are trading fees, brokerage fees, and it worries me when we say that all of the provinces will look at reviewing the fees. This too can tend to make those capital markets more accessible to those who need the capital, but perhaps at the cost of those who supply the capital. So, Mr. Speaker, I would like to say in closing that this may in fact be a worthy initiative, but it is most definitely not an initiative to be subscribed to with only a few weeks' notice and with no guarantee that there will be in fact an equal or greater level of protection for those who actually drive our capitalist system, the investors, as the protection which is available now. So, Mr. Speaker, in closing, I would ask the indulgence of the House to think about this very carefully. Thank you.
Recognize all member for Cape Breton West.
Mr. Speaker, I have just a few observations on this particular piece of legislation. I believe this is a good piece of legislation. There could be some room for some amendments, certainly at law amendments. But I believe what we have to do is we have to consider certainly the points that were raised by colleagues in the NDP caucus. But more concerning, I suppose, I was a little taken back by the observations for the member for Halifax-Chebucto, who would suggest that in a very subtle way that the minds of stockbrokers and financial advisors is less than honorable. And at that rate, he would be better off taking his money and putting it under his mattress. That would seem to be about the only level of security that honorable member would take. Mr. Speaker, as we well know, the federal government can very easily pass legislation that would surpass and basically take full responsibility for this particular matter. But the collaborative effort between the different provincial jurisdictions, because of certain actions that have taken place in the marketplace, and reference has been made to Enron and a number of other situations where Nova Scotia investors seem to have been duped. But, Mr. Speaker, in British Columbia, if you look at the Vancouver Stock Exchange, that particular securities operation affords a lot of small, high-risk companies to be able to invest, whereas if you were in the Toronto Stock Exchange, there would be very little opportunity to access venture capital. Equally so, if you look at the Alberta experience, where the regulator is also the prosecutor. So the concern has been raised over the last several months about the possible conflicts of interest. Mr. Speaker, what this bill, as I interpret, sets out to do is to ensure that the passport system does become a reality and makes it a lot easier for investors, particularly those in Atlantic Canada, to be able to have greater access to a greater market. For example, in Atlantic Canada, less than 2% of all the venture capital in Canada is invested in the entirety of Atlantic Canada. So there is a limitation there, and that does have an impact on those individuals, whether it be someone who wants to invest for their children or their grandchildren. But the fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, we have limited ourselves. There is concern as well with the licensing fees, and there has been a fair bit of criticism of the Securities Commission and the provincial government toward the provincial government for collecting too much in these licensing fees. So in effect, what we will see is not only a more uniform application through the Securities Commission nationally, the fact that we have greater mobility, but we will also see a reduction in some cases of the fees. Mr. Speaker, if this legislation was not put forth, I believe that what we would see is a more centralized approach. We know that Ontario was supposed to have signed on to this particular memorandum of agreement with the Securities Commissions from all the other provincial jurisdictions, i.e. the provincial governments, but for some reason they backed off. So, Mr. Speaker, I believe that all the considerations are there. I don't believe this is a short-term, impulsive move. I believe it's something that was in consultation with or consultation with the Securities Commissions and the regulators, that in fact this is the appropriate move, and it's something that has been in the making ever since many of these scandals that have occurred down through the United States, and hopefully we won't mention scandals in Ottawa. But anyway, suffice to say, Mr. Speaker, I believe that this bill is certainly worthy of going on to law amendments, and certainly some opportunity for additional amendments. Mr. Speaker, I also believe that the Nova Scotian consumers will benefit by this particular piece of legislation because if the licensing fees are reduced for the financial advisors or the brokers or the investors, then in fact it's like everything else. At the end of the day, somebody has to pay the bill. And I do appreciate the point that was made by the honourable member by Halifax-Chebucto on trailing fees. I think that's a very important point and worthy of some considerable examination. And I would certainly acknowledge that that's one particular issue that would deserve some close scrutiny by the Provincial Department of Labour and Environment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the Minister of Environment and Labour to close debate on Bill 168. The Minister.
Certainly appreciate the comments that were made. Just like to point out that this is uniform legislation that all Canada is looking at, and I do believe that British Columbia and Alberta have introduced the same piece of legislation with the exact same wording, as I understand it, and we're looking at trying to move along to ensure that we have the uniform legislation in place. With that, I'd like to close debate, Mr. Speaker.
Motion is for second reading of Bill number 168. Is the House ready for the question? All those in favour say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried.
Bill number 168, Chapter 418 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Securities Act.
Order Bill number 168 is sent to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to call Bill 173 for second reading. I recognize the minister will be here, and I beg your pardon. I would hope that the members would accept that the minister we expect to be here very shortly, perhaps, in case there are any questions. It's the B.
Bill number 173, the Bee Industry Act.
Yes. Yeah.
Bill number 173. Thank you.
Just 1 second.
The honourable member for Hants East.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This bill, I guess, has been one that has had some consultation from bee producers, and there have been a number. I guess one of the most contentious issues for apiaries has been introduction of disease, and in particular through parasites into bee colonies, and it actually happens most often with the introduction of queens, and producers quite often import queens into the province, and this would be the key component to splitting up hives and creating more hives, and so in order to have healthy hives, and the problem, as you might well expect, Mr. Speaker, is that some of these producers deliver hives to a wide part of the province. In other words, to a variety of locations, in order to have great enough supply of blossoms for their bees to generate or gather enough pollen to get the nectar for the production of honey. And this business of production, honey production, although a very natural thing for bees that mankind has exploited, is dependent on a couple of factors. One of them is supply of blossoms, and the other one is temperature, Mr. Speaker, because it has to be warm enough for bees to be able to fly. It's been a concern of the industry around where bees come from, the impact of those bees on the present supply of bees in the province, and some control of who actually is a producer and who isn't. And these are things that this bill addresses, in particular registration of bee producers. So, Mr. Speaker, our caucus, we really we have no problem with this bill, and we're particularly pleased that the minister has consulted with the industry on this. There's been a fair bit of discussion to try to actually meet the needs of the industry with this legislation. So with those few comments, I take my place.
Thank you. Recognize the honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd just like to speak for a few moments on this bill. And I think it's a good piece of legislation coming forward, because it's a consolidation of two acts, and this is some housekeeping and updating. But I think the two or three main things about this act, number one is that through the registration process, it is going to be a means and a mechanism to hopefully control disease that, in fact, has in some areas wiped out large numbers of bee hives, bee colonies. So I think this is going to be one of the positive things around this act. And certainly here in Nova Scotia, we need to realize that the beekeeping and the bee industry is also a foundational industry of the blueberry industry. And so therefore, that's one of the, I think, considerations that was given to some consultation with the Beekeepers Association before the final draft of this legislation. So there's really nothing substantially new here that beekeepers are in fact not aware of. The one concern that was raised with me about the Act is whether or not the regulations will actually allow for possible fees to go on to beekeepers. So with registration, will there also be fees? And with permits of the export of bees, of colonies outside the province, in fact, would this also lead to permit fees being placed there? So that was the one concern, and this bill, I think, deserves moving forward, and we'll have an opportunity later on to perhaps ask the Minister of Agriculture about this piece of legislation. And with that, I take my place, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. If I recognize the Honourable Deputy Premier, be to close debate on Bill 173. The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Bill number 173.
Motion is for second reading of Bill number 173. Is the House ready for the question? All those in favour say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried.
73, entitled An Act Respecting the Bee Industry.
Order that Bill number 173 be sent to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Mr. Speaker, move second. Speaker, would you please call Bill number 174 the Order of the General Act?
Bill number 173.